The Falklands War was a strange conflict. A group of uninteresting, unimportant, windswept islands in the South Atlantic were invaded by a local irredentist power. To recapture the territory, a British task force on the other end of the globe was assembled in 4 days and sailed over 8,000 miles across the sea and recaptured the island with limited casualties. The war lasted a little over 2 months and was an embarrassment for the Argentines, who found themselves unable to defend their newfound conquests. Within months, the military junta that had begun the conflict was overthrown, and Argentina became a democratic republic. For the Argentinians, the dispute has never been resolved. Many Argentinians still seek to one day reclaim the territory. On the British side, it cemented its place as their possession. It led to the official organisation of the Falklands as the British Overseas Territory, where the islanders granted full citizenship, and the attempt by force to conquer the islands served to delegitimise the claim held by the Argentines in the eyes of the international community, an international community that was firmly behind the Argentines before the conflict. It transformed the British national self-image from a plodding, helpful Bobby in a state of seemingly perpetual decline and instead into an enthusiastic, war-painted commando, heady with the spirit of the South Atlantic. Britain, it decided, was now ready to stride into a glorious future, and had ceased to be a nation in decline. So, what would have happened if, in an alternate world, the British had lost and the Argentinians had conquered and held on to the islands? Part 1. Context. Britain. The years prior to the Falklands War had been a bad time to be British, and that trend looked ready to continue. Since 1974, the Labour government of Harold Wilson, and then his successor Jim Callaghan, had presided over massive inflation, industrial action, a decline in British competitivity in industry, and a mismanagement of the finances that had culminated in a massive IMF bailout in 1976, a bailout that, due to poor Treasury accounting, was later to be proven to actually have been unneeded. The penultimate period of this mini-era of decline, which earned the media nickname of the Winter of Discontent, was a period between 1978 and 1979 that consisted of large-scale strike action and industrial breakdown. The strikes included miners and power workers, but almost all essential government services, including grave diggers and waste collectors. Bodies went unburied, the power went off at night, and rubbish rotted in the streets. For the British public, so recent the apex of their imperial greatness, this was traumatizing. On the back of this failure, the British people elected Margaret Thatcher. The figure of Thatcher, and the colloquial Thatcherism, has developed a reputation in the modern day. But when her policies were still fresh and new, Thatcher had not developed such a radiant self-image. Rather, she was an unpopular and radical revolutionary. Today, all Tories are basically free marketeers. In 1979, only a minority of the party identified as such. Thatcher was not emblematic of the Tory establishment. Rather, she was fiercely opposed to it. The majority of Conservative MPs identify themselves as one-nation Tories, a pragmatic blend of a wide variety of political thought. The term was coined by the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli all the way back in the late 19th century, and it lived up to its name. It discarded the more radical ideas of individualism and instead hedged itself on social obligations, especially those owed by the rich to the poor. And politically, it professed a blend of paternalism and compassionate government that prized education, class cooperation, permitted state intervention in the economy, and overall endeavoured for social welfare and political harmony. When Thatcher came to power, she may well have been Satan herself. She was an antithetical to all of them. Weaned on the economic and political philosophies of the American economist Milton Friedman and the Austrian Friedrich Hayek, Thatcher was an individualist. She saw the world in simple terms. It was the British people's instinct to get on, and at this moment in British history, it was the government's instinct to stop them. She endeavoured to get government out of the way. She saw people fundamentally as individuals, self-interested, and the free market and deregulation as a force for good. She desired, in her own words, to roll back the frontiers of the state. She and a small clique took office almost entirely through the support of pragmatic conservatives, not quite converts themselves, but judging her record of hard-nosed, disciplined, determined leadership as the only viable option in a party of what was commonly seen as floundering, compromising ninnies. It was not that she won the political debate within the party, but rather that all competitors failed to rise to the challenge. For this reason, Thatcher never enjoyed the full support of her party, and the conservative political sphere split between two hard ideological lines. This was, at least nominally, between the Dries, the supporters of Thatcher, and the Wets, who were old-style one-nation Tories. Through the years following her election in 1979 to 1982, the Dries were firmly in the minority, and she found herself woefully unpopular with the British people. This suited Thatcher. She was not very fond of consensus, and her cabinet meetings permanently changed British ministerial politics. Prior to her government, cabinet meetings had taken on the character of a real heated discussion. Thatcher, however, saw it fit to give orders, and only privately would she meet with her ministers and give the chance to be swayed otherwise in fierce one-on-one debate. whose supporters in Parliament often carried with them the spirit of the converted, believing in free market reform as necessary and in all regards a good thing. In short, they came across as obnoxious, unappealing to the British public, and were blamed for the hard-handed economic shock therapy that they thought was necessary, and which led to skyrocketing unemployment. During the coming Falklands War, businesses were being liquidated at upwards of 200 per month. Their eventual vindication on the free market problem, which would come sometime in the late 80s under the financial wisdom of her minister Nigel Lawson, would come after years of much hardship, and were a far way off yet. Her approval ratings before the Falklands War hovered at just above 20%. Unemployment was at 3 million. 10% of people, or 1 in 8, were out of work, the highest since the Great Depression. Argentina. Argentina was not faring much better during this period. Having deposed their last elected government in 1955, Argentina spent the intervening years bouncing between coup d'etat to unstable elected government and back to coup d'etat. Argentina had enjoyed a rapidly growing economy throughout the early 20th century, a boom built primarily on food exports, and the country rose to become one of the wealthiest nations in the world in 1914. However, Argentina squandered its boom. By the mid-century, it had not developed the diversified economy necessary to continue its growth. Half of Argentina's exports during this period were foodstuffs, mostly buckwheat, beef, and maize, and when commodity prices soon fell during the worldwide boom of the 50s, the economy fell with it. With a wealthy population unaccustomed to falling living standards, and a series of governments unable to implement the required reforms to protect and develop Argentine industry, a negative balance of trade had developed by the mid-1950s. To combat this, successive governments leveraged their growth on debt and printed money to pay for continued living standards. Argentina effectively sold out their economy to pay for a standard of living that they couldn't sustain, and as a result, the 70s saw the country fall into chaos. Militant action began in the countryside and in the cities, primarily leftist guerrilla actions, and the country was weakened by political extremism and general economic decline. The Argentine junta took control in 1976 via military coup, and immediately began a bloody crackdown on its political enemies. This dirty war grew to such an extent that it effectively became a mini-civil war fought between leftist guerrillas and semi-independent death squads, and served as a bloody distraction to skyrocketing inflation and declining living standards. By 1982, the Argentine government was looking for an easy win, and to distract the population, and to cement its legitimacy. With Chile a no-go following the Beagle conflict, a border conflict between Argentina and Chile over jurisdiction over some islands in the Tierra del Fuego, that was eventually resolved by the intervention of the Pope, the junta's new leader, General Leopoldo Galtieri, instead turned to the nearby Falklands territory. Part 2. War. The Falklands had always been the target of Argentinian revanchism. Much of the population, and successive Argentine governments, saw the island as rightful Argentinian territory, conquered in 1933 by the British. On occasion, the British were inclined to agree. Argentina had actually captured, potentially on the order of government ministers, although nobody knows for sure, the uninhabited British-controlled island of South Thule, south of the Falklands, in 1976, to no reaction from the British government. World opinion viewed the Falklands as essentially a colonial territory, a holdover akin to Goa, Hong Kong or Algeria, and due to be returned at some point in the near future. The Falklanders were not officially British citizens, and were ruled by a governor as a colonial possession. In that respect, the invasion of the Falklands was a PR stunt on behalf of the Argentinian government, and the junta's thought process amounted to a cheap win followed by saber-rattling. After capturing the island, the ball would be in the British court, and the new state of affairs would be accepted as a fait accompli, as no British war fleet was really going to set sail to recapture some windswept rocks. After some saber-rattling, both sides would come to an agreement that left the islands in Argentinian hands. To this end, the government rebuffed prescient warnings from American diplomats that Britain might be ready to respond militarily, and never truly planned for the expedition, logistically or militarily. This was bad form, especially considering the fact that the Argentinians were actually quite impressively armed, and had been preparing for an excursion by sea for a while. It possessed a foreign-bought stockpile of Exocet missiles, and an air force consisting of several French-built fighter jets. The government had also ordered more, including a squadron of German-built submarines, all of which would only be delivered sometime in the next year. However, the armed forces were still unprepared. They lacked the appropriate fuel tanks that would allow their French-built jets to make multiple passes over a target, and the quality control over its munitions was also poor, with their soldiers often untrained in their use of equipment. Britain, in the meantime, was demilitarizing. The British government was scrapping much of their escort fleet during this period, including assets that would later be sent to the Falklands. Ironically, if the conflict had occurred a year later in 1983, the Argentinians would have been much stronger, and the British much less capable, and the weaknesses that doomed the Argentinian war effort, primarily their limited air capabilities, their small missile stockpile, and the caution of their commanders, would have been less pronounced. When the war eventually broke out, the Argentinians occupied both the Falklands and the Sandwich Islands, including South Georgia and the minor islands nearby. The troops used for this purpose were mostly conscripts from the subtropical north of Argentina, sent over as a guarding force with little offensive capability and certainly unsuited climatically to a South Atlantic winter. Their morale plummeted when Britain actually mobilised to respond, and the Argentinian government was left floundering and listless when the British task force was assembled and heading south. The task force, under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, was sent from Gibraltar and then merged with a task force sent from the mainland United Kingdom. He first dispatched a force to South Georgia and captured it. British forces then captured the islands after a risky and casualty-laden landing and land offensive. During this entire process, the Argentine Navy, under the command of Admiral Jorge Eneas, remained hyper-cautious and kept their fleet assets close to shore. The General Belgrano, sunk by a British submarine, was enough of a loss to scare the entire fleet into retreating from any aggressive movements. Operation Banzai, a planned pincer movement to entrap the British task force between the two encroaching fleets, was canned, and the Argentine Navy played a small role in the conflict overall. The logistical situation was dismal for the Argentines. Food rotted in warehouses on shore, conscripts often stole food from the locals, and both ammunition and kit were delivered faulty. Over 60% of Argentine missiles shot during the war failed to explode. The chain of command was similarly poor, as officers were used to counterinsurgency operations against poorly armed partisans, and entire command structures did not talk to one another. The junta, unable to put together any kind of firmly structured command structure, could not organize any united effort, nor devise any coordinated war plan. When Port Stanley was captured, the entire garrison surrendered, and was sent back to Argentina under Royal Navy protection. The war ended shortly afterwards, with Galtieri deposed and his successor later dissolving the junta in favour of an elected government. The alternate war. The connected factors of Argentine failure make any sort of singular point of departure impossible, and so will give the country several advantages. Firstly, the Argentinians prepare more appropriately for the conflict, and we give them a greater time window to order their air and land assets and to plan out their campaign. Most importantly, Exocet missiles and French fighters are ordered earlier, with their crews trained on their use and appropriate target selection. Will also change the minds of the Argentinian military leadership, changing their attitude and their planning. They also work to create a unified military structure, some kind of Las Malvinas command, to coordinate their sea, air and land assets. The Argentine forces on the Falklands were badly treated and badly led. Mario Menendez, the governor of the island and the commander of the local forces, kept to himself, giving orders on paper and never really visiting his troops, instead preferring to work solely as the Falklands governor. In this timeline, he is a much more capable commander, and much more interested in Argentinian success. Rather than a lazy junta stereotype, he is the kind of nationalistic, anti-colonial commander that can rally a generally underperforming and worse-equipped military against a more technologically advanced opponent. Finally, the Argentines will dispatch the professional troops from the border with Chile to the Falklands, reinforcing their new acquisition and augmenting their defences with superior forces. Similarly to Menendez, Admiral Jorge Eneas of the Argentine Navy will be more aggressive and more competent, as well as more involved with his men and aware of both equipment issues and the strategic necessities of his situation. Despite a faulty logistical chain and a generally unprofessional officer corps, the Argentinians will be much more well prepared to conduct a campaign. The character changes are perhaps the most unrealistic part of this alternate scenario. You can't necessarily change the internal structure of an organization and just make it better. The Argentine military command existed for a purpose, that purpose being in part to enrich the officer class and to create a large grouping of conscripts with the guns required to suppress poorly armed and poorly organized militias, but not to overthrow the government or pose a serious threat to the regime. The army was intentionally decentralized and weakened in order to allow the military regime to bribe officers and commanders and to better defend against a possible counter-coup from dissatisfied subordinates and to keep their professional troops politically isolated and loyal to the military government. This, overall, should give you a picture of just how important leadership and organization are in a conflict. Argentina's lack of both is why it was so unlikely that Argentina could have won the Falklands War in our timeline. Failure to prepare is preparing to fail. This alternate war is a reversal. Despite initial successes on South Georgia and on the seas around the Falklands, the British task force is beset by air attacks and successful mission strikes. Rather than a cautious advance, the Argentine Navy steams ahead and attacks the British task force. Operation Banzai is a success, and the Argentines pincer the British from both sides, preventing a landing and sinking several British ships. Despite heavy losses for the Argentines, they managed to land a blow on the British aircraft carrier, knocking out their air assets and knocking the British onto the defensive. On the Falklands, airstrips are elongated and fortifications built. Despite several months of conflict, and with South Georgia as a vital spot for resupply and repairs, the British are unable to secure an area of operations large enough to permit a landing. If they do try, the British are out on a limb and have to fight through Argentine fortifications in order to capture any objectives. Under such conditions, maintaining a force on the island would be very difficult, if not impossible. As winter approaches and the British supply lines begin to strain, the British would retreat from the South Atlantic. The winter in the South Atlantic is too harsh for military operations and was a major fear in our timeline. The question now is that if the British, once retreating, would return the following year. I consider this likely. The war, although expensive, was incredibly popular back home. Thatcher, who was previously a fringe radical and widely considered a failure until the economic bounce back of late 1983, had been transformed from a quack into a strange mix of Winston Churchill and Boudicca. If she wished to continue the war, she could have continued long-range campaigns against the Argentine fleet, and would have had both refurbished new ships and new carriers supplied from the Americans, who had promised reinforcements in our timeline. Argentina, meanwhile, had become internationally unpopular due to their aggression, and was geographically isolated, while Britain had access to the arms markets of Europe and of America. A reasonable alternate timeline exists where this is done, and where a South Atlantic spat becomes a year-long campaign of attrition and economic warfare. But for the purposes of this timeline, the British would choose to retreat. Accepting the difficulties of the expedition, and the mounting costs and spent lives, Britain and Argentina would eventually be approached for a ceasefire by the international community, which would be accepted. With the British withdrawing, the Argentines would possibly be able to retake South Georgia, likely in the following year or in a daredevil operation during the winter, both after heavy bombing. Part 3. Outcomes. For Argentina, the war would be a fantastic success. General Galtieri would be celebrated as a national hero. Argentine politics during this era was something of a high drama, and so it is likely that he would enter into the Hallowed Halls of Fame reserved for names like General Belgrano and Evita Peron as a reclaimer of national territory and of the spirit of the Argentine people. Despite being effectively a colonial spat with little relevance to the struggles of the Third World, the conflict would be unique as a First World, Third World War in which the Third World won. The fact that the war was really just another example of the trend of a smaller, more autocratic power deciding to embark on revanchist claims against a more powerful democratic neighbour, as in the case of Uganda and Tanzania or Iraq and Iran, both similar wars that took place during this period, this would be ignored. The dramatics and emotion of yet another blow to a former colonial power, enacted by the formerly colonised, would be capitalised upon as a great success for the Third World. This would also probably add another lease on life for the current Argentine government. With a fantastic military success under his belt, Galtieri would be able to strengthen his individual rule and continue on for a few more years, extending his tenure as leader and allowing the military government to continue on far beyond its deposition in our timeline. This would not be a great outcome for the Argentine people, as under the thumb of Galtieri, the dirty war would continue, and civil liberties would continue to be repressed, even if the crackdown would likely lessen, as it was already doing so in our timeline. Despite some free market reforms and greater time to come to grips with inflation, the junta doesn't continue on for any longer than a few years. Previous juntas had been governments of transition, and were always vulnerable to internal division and counter-coups. The Argentinian junta was also not a unique government, but instead a cabal of generals that had taken over the various organs of civilian rule. Unlike Idi Amin's Uganda or Mao Zedong's China, this state is hardly totalitarian, and is incredibly restricted and thus weak against popular discontent or disobedient civil servants. It is likely that, with the regime unable to reform the economy or make good on its promises at home, Galtieri is eventually overthrown, and either a military successor or another military or civilian coup plotter sets the stage for elections to be held, a democratic, civilian government restored. For the islanders, the years after occupation would be rough. In negotiations prior to the war, Argentine officials had expressed desires to only exercise sovereignty over the territory. they would happily maintain a local democratic form of government, local laws, customs, and language. A desire to pamper the islanders was expressed, which would have likely benefited the islanders more than remaining in Britain, as they did in our timeline. The Shackleton Report, commissioned before the war, theorised that between a third and a half of the island's population would be happy under Argentine authority, permitting a suitable buyout of land and arrangements to be made to move all those that wished to remain British back to their home country. Following the island's conquest, dissidents and those deemed too British-leaning to be trusted would be kidnapped, arrested, or deported. Martial law would likely remain on the island for some time, with either no civilian government at all, or a maintained colonial government under strict military supervision. Some British customs or local laws may be maintained, but it is just as likely that Argentine officials would seek it to make a territory of either the province of Tierra del Fuego or some new province of the Las Malvinas and Sandwich Islands, integrating it fully into the Argentine national state. A settlement of the island by Argentine commercial interests is also possible, populating the island with more Spanish-speaking immigrants in order to reduce irredentist and pro-British discontent. Due to the island's delicate economy, however, it is unlikely that Britishers would ever be deported, and so they would continue to contribute to the island's economy even if as a disenfranchised minority. Much like the South African Afrikaners, we could see many Falklands Islanders leave the island for similar climates in Guernsey, Northern Ireland, or Scotland, and return home to Britain, no longer desiring to live in a state where their language, culture, and laws are not predominant. Following the transition into democracy, the Falklands would likely be granted their own autonomy, but as the island was conquered and rights lost and never easy to regain, it would never be as loose and freeform as was promised during prior negotiations. To this day, the Las Malvinas and English-speaking inhabitants would be a black mark in Argentine politics, akin to the Patagonian native peoples in how they were conquered and marginalised with little compensation. In Britain, the outcome would be disastrous. Battered warships would return to Portsmouth Harbour with little to show for their efforts, and the casualties would be seen as having been suffered in vain. Thatcher, following a short boost in her popularity following the outbreak of the war, would see her popularity plummet even further past that which she experienced in our world. Thatcher considered the spirit of the South Atlantic as having a supernatural effect on the British psyche, a spirit and idea that we have ceased to be a nation in retreat. With the failure to retake the islands, British chauvinism would suffer a blow, and the idea of Britain's national pride being locked to a small set of islands in the South Atlantic would appear laughable rather than patriotic. Despite the Conservatives being considered the party that lost the war, it is not a given that Labour would, as expected, storm the polls and return to office. During this period, Labour was under the tenure of Michael Foot, a divisive and militant socialist who, in our timeline, would bring the Labour Party to its worst electoral result in half a century. It was his election that, in 1980, split the Labour Party and created the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, under Shirley Williams MP, who would later campaign an alliance with the Liberal Party to force a crowbar into the two-party duopoly which had until now dominated British politics. In the years of 1981 to 1982, it was predicted that Alliance could have won over 100 seats in Parliament, potentially beating out the Conservatives. Due to the two-party system, this is unlikely. For every 6 voters lost by Labour to the SDP Liberal Alliance, the Conservatives lost only 1. I would predict that, with the loss in the Falklands, the Conservatives would be reversed in their position of superiority against Labour. Conservative safe seats are much easier to lose than Labour's safe seats, as they carry smaller majorities, and the SDP Liberals mostly appealed to the middle-class and countryside voters that dominated these constituencies. Any unsafe Conservative seats would be eaten up by the Alliance, while Labour would retain their traditional heartland. The Alliance would swallow the centre ground, creating a Conservative loss similar to the 2024 election, as a left-centre party swallows up the undecided electorate. And with Foot remaining unappealing to the British public, it is likely that the SDP Liberal Alliance would earn a sizable majority as a result. This would make them kingmaker in a hung parliament, and with the Tory loss in their opposition to Thatcher's policies, the Alliance would go into coalition with Labour and form a new unity government. This would probably require Michael Foot to be replaced as leader. My first choice is the more left-centrist Dennis Healey, then deputy leader of the Labour Party, and unproclaimed leader of the Labour Party's right wing, or perhaps even the up-and-coming Neil Kinnock. Foot was the root cause for the SDP Liberal split, and with him gone, the Labour Party would be able to ally much more closely with the alliance. The SDB, sympathetic to some free market reforms, but seeing itself as also treating mass unemployment seriously, would spearhead much of the agenda throughout the early years, and not the funding Labour Party. Britain would go into the latter half of the 80s with a truly social democratic government. With the initial Thatcher reforms pushed through, the economic growth that this allowed would give the government enough buffer to not return to the stagnation of the late 70s, but to instead push forwards. The economic boom created by Thatcher would still appear during the Labour STP government, and so it would be this government that would take credit, likely continuing some minor free market reforms like what was seen in France and Germany during the same period. Economic growth would be lesser in this timeline, with no large-scale house-buying schemes or deregulation of the financial sector until later into the 90s. But the most damaging effects of Thatcherism, the mega-privatisation, the centralisation of power around Westminster, and the around inefficient ministries, and the deindustrialisation of the North and destruction of the unions, would be avoided. It is likely that the first year of a Labour government would have been an internal campaign by a figure such as Denis Healey or Neil Kinnock to crush the far left and the militant Labour faction within the party. Labour, prior to the reforms of Kinnock in 85 and 86 in our timeline, was a cesspool of infighting, factionalism, and self-interested and indolent unionists. Trotskyists and Bennites would be sidelined, especially following the 1985 miners' strike, and we would see government preserve the Thatcherist policies of abolishing the closed-shop methods of unionisation, at least without a supermajority of the union membership supporting it, outlawing double picket lines, and a general pragmatic approach buoyed by the SDB Liberal coalition, providing a solid bed of MPs that would vote alongside government policies. If a far-left figure like Tony Benn earned himself a cabinet position, it would likely be to appease the militant left, as the late 80s would be characterised by a rightward turn on the unions and a stride for a new British settlement, rather than the absolute destruction of the trade unions as a political force outside of the Labour Party. This would be more difficult than it was in Germany or France, as Britain's trade unions are much more strongly rooted, but it would be an easier pill to swallow with the alliance in coalition. Industries such as British Gas, British Telecom, and Rolls-Royce would never be privatised, while different strategies would be taken on the Westland affair, avoiding privatisation in favour of bailouts and reform. Rather than being sold to American investors, it would be more likely that Labour would overcome its anti-European biases to instead collaborate more closely with the continent. British Leyland would likely be dissolved in this timeline, as it was one of the most inefficient and outdated companies in the country. A Nordic-style government investment scheme would be set up to deal with the North Sea oil fields, funding a sovereign wealth fund similar to the kind found in Norway or Kuwait. This would help buttress the government's finances, allowing it to better fund its extensive social welfare policies and to prepare for the future at the expense of immediate massive growth. Labour during this period was an anti-European party, with strong tendencies towards nuclear disarmament and abolishing the House of Lords. With the coalition, the Labour Party would be unable to embark on its more enthusiastic desires to leave the European Economic Community, and Britain would remain a member. The Troubles would likely reach a fever pitch as they did in our timeline, with similar bombings, but with a Labour government in power, it would be easier for negotiations to be reached. We could see a ceasefire earlier than in our world, as with the politics of both the various IRA factions and Sinn Féin as they were, the kind of close coordination that could be provided by anyone who wasn't as boneheaded as Margaret Thatcher would be more than enough to bridge the gap between the two sides. By the late 80s, both the Catholic and Protestant populations were already sick of the fighting, and we could see a Good Friday Agreement reached in perhaps 1993 or 1994. However, with politics as they were, it's impossible to predict whether the sides whose opinion really mattered, mainly the militant factions of Sinn Féin and the IRA, would be willing to come to the table early, no matter who was in charge in London. The 1985 miners' strike would have been the most dangerous period of this government's term, but Labour would not side with the miners. It is likely that an early agreement would have been reached, likely with a whopping great pay rise, as ideological concerns about not bending to the unions would not be a factor for a Labour STP government. As the economy improves and some free market reforms are begrudgingly accepted as terms of the SDP coalition, Britain would recover from its early 80s malaise and join the late 80s, early 90s world economic boom. If the Labour SDP coalition stays together, they would go on to win the 1987 election, but the Conservative Party would not be crippled from this loss. The Tories are survivors, with interests primarily settled in British values and conservative interests rather than specific ideology. And so we could see them bounce back in the 1992 or 1993 election under the leadership of someone like William Whitelaw or Michael Heseltine, who were both on the central ground between the dries and the wets, and would exist as a much more centrist party than they became in our timeline. There is also the potential for a figure like Norman Tebbit to gain power, but due to his personal family obligations and a low support base within the party, it seems unlikely. Both of these figures, however, were more centrist than Thatcher, and still committed to the collective good and social obligations, they would not roll back the frontiers of state nearly as far as Thatcher did in our world, but would likely cut away the deadwood and manage the country in a manner similar to John Major in our world, working closely with Europe and the Labour-run city councils of London and the north of England, which will remain much more powerful than in our timeline. There is also the potential that an SDP Liberal coalition would only form with the promise of implementing a proportional representative voting system, which, if done, would transform the United Kingdom from a duopolistic political system to a multi-party democracy. Following the 90s, it is likely that Labour would drift leftward, becoming the home to the trade unions, Trotskyists, and the far left. The SDP, meanwhile, would come to share the centre ground with the Liberals, perhaps merging as was done in our timeline, although this is unlikely, as without the need to band together against a first-past-the-post system that is biased towards the two largest parties, the two could coexist without fear of crowding one another out. The Tories would likely remain unsplit, as their political traditions are strongly rooted throughout the 90s. A split may form in the 2000s, however, mainly spearheaded by the National Front, which in this timeline could potentially win a seat in Parliament, as well as the many seats they won in the European Parliament in our world. Today, Britain would be a much more social democratic country. With a sovereign wealth fund and no real Thatcherist tradition, neoliberalism would be considered un-British, implementable only in small shock therapies when industries fail, or when the government is forced to eventually sell off or close its unproductive industries in coal or energy. It would also be a more industrialised country, although perhaps not as wealthy without the financial reforms of Thatcher's second and third terms, but certainly more egalitarian and socially oriented. Rather than the Thatcher settlement, our current era of British political history would be defined by the Labour-Liberal settlement, which prioritises the protection of British industry, the egalitarian nature of the British character, and certain neoliberal policies in a contained manner. Rather than the hell-let-loose nature of rampant privatisation and free market growth, Britain looks a lot more like its European counterparts in France or Germany. It is also more collectivist and socially minded, with a population much more willing to look out for one another. The counterculture to this would be intense, and you can expect a lot more right-wing punk and a lot more dissatisfied British entrepreneurs moving to countries such as America or Ireland, as they find the socialistic British common society far too stifling for their own interests. Thatcher's centralising state reforms do not create the bumbling, oversized British ministerial state that exists now. Instead, it is a much more decentralised and healthy society, where the central government has much less power than in our world. The Greater London Council is never dissolved as it was under Margaret Thatcher, and as a result, council homes are more easily built, and the city governed more by Labour policies than financially oriented Conservative ones. Sites like Canary Wharf are developed later or not at all, and the growth of the financial sector is small, never coming to dominate the city as it did in our world. Going into the 90s, the London Stock Exchange and London financial sector remain a secondary player on the world stage, extraordinarily influential in Europe, but more regional and niche than the giants in Tokyo, Shanghai, or New York. It remains akin to Hong Kong or Singapore. Protectionist policies and investment in industrial modernisation also make British industry competitive abroad in only a few key fields, while the cost of modernising British industry in fields such as shipbuilding and mineral and oil extraction soak up much of the capital that would be spent on more lucrative investments. In some ways, Britain sacrifices greater wealth for its own pride in manufacturing and to compete with France and Germany, but also sacrifices rapid growth for the welfare of its citizens. In our timeline, British industry was actually growing cheaper than its European competition, and so a more productive and modernised industrial sector, coupled with a period of low inflation and low interest rates, could see British companies outcompete their European rivals in some key sectors. We would also see general strikes become much more common in a Britain with a more powerful union movement, leading to a style of union militancy and political action that would keep class consciousness alive in Britain and draw a starker cultural divide between America and the United Kingdom. The Labour Party would maintain its tradition of ping-ponging between unelectable socialists such as Jeremy Corbyn and Michael Foot, and more electable centrists such as Tony Blair and Keir Starmer. However, it is unlikely that Tony Blair would have risen to such prominence. A social democratic candidate would have instead risen to lead the party, backed by the unions, especially if the alliance manages to get in their proportional voting system and the SDP and Liberals remain a large force, disincentivising Labour from moving to the centre and instead turning it into a real, revolutionary, union-based party. For reasons previously mentioned, devolutionist movements might not rise to as much popularity in our world. With a sense of Britishness not damaged by decisions such as deindustrialisation and the poll tax, and the centralisation of the economy around the south of England, and in particular London, the Welsh and Scottish public would be content with their regional, council-level autonomy. Northern Ireland would remain a political exception, although the Stormont is likely no more stable in this timeline than it is in ours, even after the end of the Anglo-Irish conflict there. As for Britain's other overseas territories, there are few left to lose. It is likely that China will recover Hong Kong at a similar time as in our timeline, as its acquisition relied on the wording of a Victorian-era land leasing scheme. Britain would mostly lose to Germany, which, due to Britain's slower economic growth, would have a greater grasp over the European joint economy and eventually the European Union. Following reunification, Britain would still remain somewhat isolated from Europe, fearful of German economic dominance on the continent. Nonetheless, relations remain stable, even if Britain, like in our timeline, continues to struggle for greater influence and independence from the European Economic Community and later the European Union. Without huge job losses, and with the state-backed retraining schemes and industrial projects being pushed harder in the late 80s, rather than the Thatcher strategy, which was to let the free market sort it all out, the welfare-dependent underclass is smaller, and the working population much larger and better skilled. Conceptions of vague British greatness, the kind that led to the ideas of going it alone that inspired Brexit, are not as important or prescient. However, we could still see the rise of a party akin to UKIP or Reform earlier in this timeline, likely earning a few seats in Parliament early in the 2010s under a younger Nigel Farage. It would run on a campaign of some Euroscepticism, but mostly anti-immigration and global scepticism, and attempt to model itself off similar parties such as the National Front in France and the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. It would find a base from those dissatisfied with their cultural exclusion, mass immigration, and globalization, but would be a much less populist party than they are in our world, due to the much smaller underclass in this Britain. As the 2010s develop, and especially after COVID-19, they could potentially become a peer player to the Conservative Party, or at least the SDP and the Liberals. In some ways, this is a better world. Britain, despite being a less wealthy and dynamic society, is a much more socialistic and compassionate one. Government is more localised, and the economy less predicated upon services. The North is richer in this timeline, and the country less focused around London, instead being more geographically egalitarian with its wealth spread throughout the country. Rather than a Thatcher settlement, we have a settlement based on consensus politics, a liberal Labour settlement based in social democracy, consensus between the parties, and joint efforts between government, the unions, and business. British capitalism is much more reserved, but more stable. However, Britain is relegated to becoming a regional player, the bridge between the United States and Europe, but uncompetitive on the world stage militarily. That is all for this alternate history. For those interested, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and potential disagreements in the comments section. Have a great day.